Tourism is a good example of globalization, and it also highlights both the positive and negative aspects of our modern world. It encompasses issues ranging from economics, political sovereignty, culture, and the environment. With the recent pause on travel during the pandemic, it has caused industry leaders to reflect, such as the World Tourism Organization Secretary, who stated, "Now is also the time to rethink tourism, where it is going, and how it impacts people and planet." To analyze the state of tourism, we can first look at what it is, the economics of it, issues relating to authenticity as well as culture, and its sustainability as an industry. Tourism, as defined by the World Tourism Organization, is the movement of people to countries or places outside their usual environment for personal or business and professional purposes. Although travel for leisure has existed in one form or another throughout history, there are two factors that distinctly separate today's modern iteration of travel from past iterations. The first factor is the increased industrialization and commercialization of travel. This is, of course, due to the Industrial Revolution, which for some is the biggest mistake and root of all issues in the world, or for others is a necessary step towards progress. Either way, advances in freight and passenger transportation, such as rail, were a big driver in enabling the increasingly urbanized masses to travel in the 20th century. Thomas Cook is credited to have started the modern tourist industry by combining modern transportation methods along with hospitality into a private enterprise, providing packaged tours and excursions. This increased degree of planning and investment in capital are a key feature of today's form of travel. An example of this being the packaged holiday vacation. The second factor that defines today's tourism is the rationalization of the activity. For many pre-industrial societies and cultures, the reasons to travel might have been just part of one's lifestyle, such as a semi-nomadic or nomadic peoples, or might have been tied to a religious pilgrimage to undergo a transformation. Today's tourism industry also is underpinned by this need for a transformative experience, but now the reasoning is secularized and generalized to a mass of people with differing goals. The rationalization might also be financial. As is noted in the book Native Tours, the modern paid vacation was rationalized as much as a means of increasing industrial productivity as it was intended to provide relief to those who toiled on behalf of industry. What then are some of the impacts and consequences of the modern iteration of travel? The first major aspect of tourism to look at is the economics and the associated costs and benefits. Some important things to keep in mind when analyzing tourism is that it is a highly mediated activity with many parties taking part, including local governments, citizens, private enterprises, tourists, and nonprofit organizations. The main benefit and arguments for tourism is that it can promote economic growth, provide employment, and stimulate business and entrepreneurial opportunities for the local population. This is evident with the overall volume of economic activity it contributes. Despite the 2020 pandemic, the industry has bounced back to represent 6.1% of the world economy, and 1 out of 11 people are employed through it. A comprehensive literature review analyzing multiple studies concluded that tourism drives and enables economic development. A more important aspect is the nature of that growth. Although tourism-led growth has provided opportunities for development and has an association with GDP growth, a study found that when standard income determinants are controlled for, such as capital accumulation, tourism no longer maintained its marginal explanatory power even within major international tourism economies. As the paper stated, the industry does not grow in isolation and is dependent upon existing infrastructure, a skilled labor force, and investment and cooperation from governments and citizens. The main takeaways is that tourism should be used strategically and part of a broader economic development plan and policy. An example that does not use tourism in a strategic manner would be some of the FIFA World Cup events, such as the Brazil 2014 World Cup. Part of the reasoning and justification for the event is that tourism will enable economic growth, attract investors, and raise the public profile of the country. But in this example, we can see that one possible downside of this strategy, that being opportunity costs. A large part of the investments for the event were for new stadiums, but some of these projects crowded out investment in other areas such as transportation, healthcare, and education. This caused and fueled many of the public protests in the country at the time. The 7-1 loss to Germany did not help the country either. A notable aspect of tourism is whether it causes or reinforces inequality. The short answer is yes, it does cause inequality, to a degree. Some studies, when looking at just one country, may find tourism increases income inequality, while others say it raises the standard of living. Comprehensive studies from the University of London and Griffith University looked at datasets from around the 1990s to 2012 on developing economies around the world. They both came to the conclusion that there is a statistically significant relationship with income inequality and tourism. The magnitude of the inequality varies from country to country and can be accounted for through regulation and distribution efforts by a local government. There is an interesting point that the Griffith study noted that the relationship of tourism revenue and income inequality in developing economies does follow the Kuznets curve hypothesis, which states that if the current level of tourism becomes double, then it will significantly reduce the income inequality in developing economies. The results show that a 1% raise in squared tourism revenue decreases income inequality by 0.115%. One reason as to why tourism has this adverse effect is because many times the services of the industry, such as accommodations, entertainment, and transportation, are managed by a handful of large multinational companies forming an oligopoly. This environment makes it difficult for small to medium-sized enterprises to compete, which can lead to unequal distribution of gains. Another impact is excessive leakage. In economics, this refers to when capital or income is diverged from an iterative flow, such as a local economy. Examples of leakage can include imports of food and beverages or hotel chains, where part of the revenue gained will leak out from the host country to the destination of the foreign company. Leakage itself is not necessarily a bad thing. There are many goods and services that people want which divert revenue and capital to foreign markets and companies. The issue, however, is when a significant part of tourism-derived revenues leak out of the host country. This can lead to less growth, unemployment, and inequality. This insight presents a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, tourism can be a viable strategy to economic development, but it might result in an initial stage of inequality and require some time before income distribution evens out. But the possible benefits are heavily dependent on if the government properly invests in tourism as part of a larger development plan and creates the necessary infrastructure and regulation to account for potential costs. With the economics out of the way, we can look at the culture of tourism and the question of what makes tradition or culture authentic. A large part of tourism and its marketing is to experience other cultures and their traditions in an authentic manner. But what does authenticity mean, and how does it arise? An intuitive answer to what is and makes a cultural tradition authentic is how well it is maintained and how true it is to the original idea. This requires a degree of isolation from encroachment of tourists, which might take away from the original meaning. This is similar to how biological species develop and assume unique characteristics as a result of adaptation to particular ecological niches. However, a counter to this view is presented in the book Native Tours that states, "It seems just as likely that distinct culturally identifying traditions have often developed as a result of processes of differentiation that arise from exchanges between cultures. In this sense, cultural traditions are constructed more from recognition of difference than they are the result of a lack of exposure to other cultures. Cultures are derived from one another in many ways, and because of this, authenticity therefore can be partly defined by the level of autonomy a group of people have in determining how and why they carry on a particular tradition. The symbols and outward appearance don't have to match up completely to past iterations. Rather, what is more relevant is how a culture and the people tied to it can effectively express and negotiate that culture. An example is the North Carolina Cherokee community's arts and craft tradition. The federal government encourages, sponsors, and has oversight over the design and production of crafted items, and tourists' tastes influence this as well. But the Eastern Cherokee have a degree of control over the process and have adapted their production and sale to fit in with their values. Some cultural ideas that remain faithful to the Cherokee culture are participatory rather than hierarchical decision-making, the notion of non-competitiveness, and respect for elders. Are these items exactly what the Cherokee ancestors created? Not quite, but the process, values, and degree of autonomy are present, which arguably is what matters most. There are several cases of particular ethnic groups having negative impacts from tourism, such as forming an economic dependency on it, taking away from their agricultural lifestyle, getting exposed and addicted to drugs, and being seen as more an object of curiosity. A more positive and well-known example are the Amish, who have maintained their cultural and religious traditions and are economically independent while also being a tourist attraction. The increased exposure as a result of tourism can help increase awareness of these groups and their issues, in addition to strengthening their cultural traditions. The principle of autonomy can be a good proxy in determining if a particular ethnic group is being treated fairly when engaging in tourism activities. The extreme logical conclusion of autonomy is a scenario where a community that has the ability to decide to tear down all of its historic buildings in order to construct a golf course for tourists is more authentic than is another community that has been prohibited by higher authorities from doing the same thing in order to preserve the integrity of its past. This extreme example highlights that without some degree of autonomy and intentionality, then a cultural symbol at best becomes an empty token and not a real expression of one's tradition. And in the worst case scenario, they become a mocking caricature. A final note on authenticity is that the demand that tourists have to explore old traditions in an authentic manner may be a reaction against modernity, as is stated in native tours. Paradoxically, the search is itself an expression of the modernity from which the tourist seeks to escape. In this sense, the attachment of the label traditional to particular objects, places, and people serves to establish their pervasive influence of modernity by imagining those few objects of desire that are supposedly not modern. Lastly, is tourism environmentally sustainable? As it is currently, probably not. This is not unique to tourism, but rather is due to humans not being good at thinking long term. Tourism is a double-edged sword when it comes to the environment. On the one hand, it can erode and destroy local lands and habitats. But on the other hand, it can bring awareness and resources to the preservation of not only geologically diverse ecosystems, but the way of life of the locals who reside there. The common theme or insight when looking at tourism, and particularly in the context of a globalized world, is that of autonomy. This can mean autonomy in economic decisions. It can refer to having a say in how one's culture and people are represented to the world. And lastly, autonomy also encompasses having control over one's local environment. Globalization, economies of scale, and other benefits of the modern world can without a doubt make it possible for people to travel and explore remote areas and different cultures. However, this cannot be at the cost of taking away agency from locals, whether that be a village, city, country, or nation. Similar to the idea of how one's freedom ends where another's begins, in travel, one should be mindful in entering another's home as you leave yours.